This is no ordinary factory. But look at a recent edition of a Washington newspaper and you will learn that this is where the CIA deciphers and decodes all the material it gets from the various American spy satellites. Such disclosures about the CIA, and above all about what goes on here at its headquarters just outside Washington, these are the hot news stories of the moment. Meanwhile, the full story of the military coup in Chile is causing the CIA yet more trouble. As post-Watergate digging continued, it came out that the CIA had sent millions of dollars to various groups who opposed President Allende, who was overthrown in the coup. The United States was attempting to get the sort of government it liked into power in a foreign country.
I'm glad to repeat this story because there's a new generation growing up who believe what they're told by history books, I suppose. And it wasn't at all like that. Allende was very successful, and of course the machinery he was using, which we provided, was part of that success. The CIA acted and moved in and destroyed the government and killed Allende. And I've often felt that if we hadn't been so successful, Allende would still be alive and the democratic government of Chile wouldn't have gone into decline for all those years. By a very strange quirk of fate, I think that the very success of what we did in Chile was instrumental in bringing down the government.
Within the computing community within the last decade, the key thing that was being observed was that there was a lot better way to interact with a computer. Computer networks were not only needed but were valuable, and they are gradually coming into fruition.
In California in the 1970s, something new was happening.
The Network Information Center, which is located at Stafford Research Institute in California, sees the network as this multi-leveled experiment in resource sharing that allowed data to be shared, computers to talk to each other, and so forth.
The ARPANET had one goal: to connect large mainframe computers separated by thousands of miles. The U.S. government, who financed the network, and the American universities carrying out the work, wanted the fastest possible way to communicate with the fewest obstacles.
It's quite clear that material will be moved and handled and stored in computer systems rather than in filing cabinets.
We know the end of this story. The ARPANET would become the basis for the modern internet. The networks we now depend on still reflect the purpose and worldview of its time and place: open, uncontrolled, and uncontrollable. But there is another story. A hemisphere away, a group of programmers in Santiago, Chile were building a network of their own. Project Cybersyn had a purpose, ethos, and design completely different from the American network. In the 2 brief years it lasted, Cybersyn's creators saw the shape of something unique, something that was lost before we ever really learned what it could have meant to a networked world.
With the Andes Mountains only a few miles away, Santiago, capital of Chile, has a spectacular setting. Growing each year in size and importance, Santiago's population approaches the 1 million mark. Santiago is a real metropolis. Perhaps what most impresses the newcomer is the modern architecture.
Chile was for many, an exceptional case in Latin America because it was an apparently strong democracy with strong institutions, and it had developed in the 60s a close relationship with the United States.
Chile was part of the informal U.S. empire, both economically and politically. The key industries in Chile were controlled by U.S. multinational corporations.
So Chile had this image of a country that was politically advanced, but its society lived in still underdeveloped economic conditions, which made Chilean society very unequal. The copper companies, the US copper companies in Chile, had taken more out of the country than they had actually left in the country. And that was the mark of Chilean politics in the 1960s. The idea that transformation was necessary, that radical change in some areas was necessary.
In 1970, there was the election of a new president for Chile, and at that time the person who was at the forefront was Salvador Allende. He was elected, and that was an extraordinary change in the direction of the country.
Allende and his government promised and planned nationalizing, that is, expropriating some particular factories and businesses that they thought were central to the carrying out of their economic project.
Allende intended to expropriate the copper mines and the telephone service, which were controlled by these U.S. multinational corporations. The Nixon administration feared Allende for what he represented for the rest of Latin America.
Everything we do with the Chilean government will be watched by other governments and revolutionary groups in Latin America as a signal as to what they can do in their way.
The idea was to have an industrial sector run by the government. The idea was to nationalize a number of industries rather than having big televisions to very few. The companies were transformed to produce small televisions for the large number of people. I was there working in aspects of regional development. Curiously enough, Fernando Flores was given responsibility for regional development as well. He was the person who was the tutor of my own work.
And I was 27 years old. I found myself an important job in the government of Allende, in charge of the supervision of the whole industrial complex. I was more mature than the people of that age. They were all young people. That's what revolutions are. I reached positions of influence and power and intellectual that none of my companions get. And not because I was more intelligent, it's because I said I was more involved. And involvement is something very important in life. This is not about theory for me. It was always about how to improve the problem, the issue, the organization I am working.
We need to change the direction of the industry. We need to make it much more responsive to the needs of the people.
We knew that we have a big challenge that with the normal idea of management is going to work.
The traditional way of sending reports and managing industries, where you had bureaucrats preparing memos, sending them through the post, and if you wanted to have an overview of the whole company, of the whole industry, it might have taken months. It was necessary for us, and I think it was particularly important for me, to connect information with communications.
Inspiration of Cybersyn. The political merit in myself, and the intellectual contribution is Stafford Beer. I found his book that he calls Cybernetics and Management. And a year after, I discovered a second book of him called Decision and Control.
So he arrived with a book and passed it to a number of us, and new things came of it.
Stafford has the talent, then he can see things that we don't see.
Suddenly, our eyes were open. Cybernetics offered an alternative.
Cybernetics dealt with a new world. It offered mechanisms for dealing with things that nobody knew anything about. I mean, it's almost impossible, even for my generation, let alone yours, to understand what it was like to be confronted by a computer. I mean, these people had only just come to grips with the steam engine. I used to go to my father's office and see these huge machines. They spat out bits of paper that people had to decode. And as I say, they had virtually no function. They could just add up and subtract if you were lucky. Nonetheless, it was shocking, these great big machines that had all this potentiality that was emerging. How do you manage a world like that? We need a new science that moves between the gaps between the sciences to cope with the new world. The science of control and communication in the human and the machine.
The computer can generate untold variety, and all of this is pumped into a system originally designed to handle the output of 100 quill pens. If one of those unworkable institutions we were discussing buys a computer, what happens?
Computers have made it possible for IRS to process millions more returns than would have been possible by hand.
It uses the thing to do more elaborately exactly what was done before. You know how this looks. The institution's activity is divided into chunks. In every chunk there is a boss man, with lesser bosses reporting to him and running the smaller chunks. We are not dealing with pistons, pumps and distributor arms, but with people. And the connections between the parts are not crankshafts, pipes and electrical wires, but human relationships.
Myself and Flores, we start to talk about how to proceed with the management of the industry.
And then I begin to think how I can go to the sources. And we sent this letter to Stafford Beer. And he replied to me, if you come to London, please come to see me, because we can talk more. I had never been in Europe. And I went there. I met with Stafford Beer.
And they discussed how to proceed with these ideas of the nationalized industry.
And surprise, from the conversation, he offered himself to come to Chile. Something unexpected for me. We knew also that maybe we don't have the time, that it's going to be a coup before.
The victory of Allende would be a sort of demonstration that there was a possibility of socialism through democracy, and that there was no vital contradiction between socialism and democracy, which is what the political discourse of the United States in the Cold War was. You can't have socialism and democracy at the same time.
He's heading for a one-party state. He's getting control of the press. He's isolating the military. He's treating the military just like Hitler did. There'll never be another free election in Chile. I think unless we become too dangerous to tackle, there's going to be a constant erosion of our international position.
There were two different means to achieve that end, but the one that actually was implemented in all its breadth was the attempt to create the conditions for a coup, for a military coup. And that was done under Nixon's explicit orders. So the CIA provided weapons and money to these groups that were plotting to kidnap the head of the army and provoke an institutional crisis and push the army to intervene, taking over. The attempt was botched, the general was killed, and no coup occurred. It led to the opposite effect, a consolidation of the idea that Allende was the legitimate winner of the election, and that's because it was very apparent that there was some sort of foreign intervention in it.
Nixon summoned CIA Director Richard Helms to the Oval Office.
The real thing you need to have from me is first this assurance. I am not going to embarrass the CIA because it's very important. Second, I don't believe in dirty tricks. I think you've got to do it.
And gave Helms a list of instructions. And on this list was the expression, make the economy scream.